Hello today, my name is Luke Hinsley, and my goal is to save the world. The means in which I intend to use is politics, or rather government, and specifically as a representative in the Australian federal government. Now, politics and government are related, but they're not the same thing. Government is the most powerful institution humanity has ever created. It's our collective counterbalance to essentially everything else. You can pray to God for protection from an oncoming storm, but the government is not supposed to pray. It's supposed to build the levees. When it fails, it's because of politics, and we're conditioned to hate it because of politics. For several years now, I've wanted to run as an independent, and to better myself for the task ahead, I've been studying. I'm in the final stages of completing a bachelor's degree where I've majored in politics and policy studies and international relations with a minor in global challenges. I bring that up because I want to have a grown up conversation on what it is I've learned from my perspective. Perspective is a recurring theme, along with ideology, division, change, purpose. It's a rich tapestry. Colonialism, like, really? You're going to bring up colonialism too? Well, there's a reason why I, as a white Australian, speak English. We cannot separate ourselves from the sins of our past, the sins of our fathers, so to speak, lest we risk repeating them. Related to change and perspective is the event, the catalyst for change, which for this discussion will mostly center on the event as the apocalypse, as in the rapture, doomsday, the end of the world. Not literally the biblical end of the world, but it's perceived at that level. It's the thing that changes everything. People have been predicting it forever, and I will contend that there isn't just one apocalypse. There have been many. Some were predicted and some weren't, and there will be more to come. It's the nature of our universe. I want to be honest with you. Things are not looking good right now, and things are not looking good for the future either. Not to spoil the ending, but this video will even conclude with a plea to Americans because your democracy is in danger. But this won't be all doom and gloom. In discussing where the problems lie, I will talk about the problems we've faced previously, when the event has arisen, where we have worked together to address it, and we have prevailed. It doesn't happen often, but it is possible. This will be a complicated network of overlapping themes and motifs that I'm still piecing together and trying to make sense of in my own mind, but I will try to make it as simple and as accessible as possible. So, here is my main contention. You have been deceived. You, me, we, the vast majority of us have been deceived. We have been propagandized to believe that the world is a certain way, and it's not. Now, I'm not talking about lizard people or aliens, nothing that interesting. It has to do with semantics, wordplay, distortions of meaning, and perspective. It's not that the world is completely different, it's just a slight variance of what we think it is. There's the reality, and then there's the marketing. We think we live in democracies that are of the people, by the people, for the people. That's the marketing of liberal democracy, which favors the private sector over the public. We see this all the time when governments repeatedly represent the interests of big business and industry over the interests of people. If you're willing to take some time to hear me out, I will explain what I mean, and hopefully a lot of things will start to make sense. While I am Australian and my perspective centers here, the Western world is mostly made up of variances of liberal democracies. The baseline ideology is the same, so our governments may behave similarly within your cultural framework. This might explain a few things for you too. So, let's get started, shall we? Chapter 1. It was capitalism all along. Yes, obviously, capitalism is a problem. I'm not breaking new ground here or trying to portray myself as some oracle that has seen what nobody else has. But in discussing the problems of the world, you have to make mention of capitalism. It's dishonest to ignore it. Now, I'm not saying that capitalism is entirely a bad thing and must be discarded. No, necessity is the mother of invention, but capitalism is the mother of development. It gave us the Industrial Revolution, which gave us the need for an educated workforce, and education is the means to emancipation. I believe there is a place in society for capitalism. There is a balance to be had. It just cannot be the driving force behind all of human civilization, as it is now. Every problem we face, every failure to address them, can be traced back to capitalism. Inequality, racism, sexism, colonialism, the divisions in our society stem from the goal of capital accumulation. Capitalism is a cancer in the foundation of our governments because its roots are in the political ideologies. We in the Western world live in variations of liberal democracies, with political liberalism as the foundation. Our constitutions and legal systems are written according to political liberalism. The authorities and limitations of our governments are determined by it. So it's a good idea to understand what it means. When Europeans first created governments, their goal was to limit its power, which makes sense as governments were replacing monarchs, who ruled by divine right with absolute authority. Kings could have you thrown in a dungeon with no charge and no recourse just because they didn't like you. Not letting a government do that kept one tyrant from replacing another. Now, I think there's a bit of confusion about what liberalism actually means, mainly because Americans tend to use the term liberal incorrectly regarding politics. They often use the term to mean open-minded or progressive, but that's not what it means. It is permissive, but that's not the same thing. Americans divide themselves politically between left and right. Australians do too, to a lesser extent. We likewise have a two-party duopoly, where the main divisions lie. For Americans, left is seen as liberal and right is seen as conservative. Not that that's incorrect. The thing is, though, you can be both depending on where you apply them. Let me try to conceptualize it for you. Liberal and conservative are variations on three basic concepts. They are an ideology about regulation and the concept of no. Conservatism is an authoritarian ideology about regulating that no, you cannot do something. It forces its perspective on others, whereas liberalism is a permissive ideology about having no regulation. Let me give you some examples of differences between their use in social and economic contexts. Social conservatism would be like regulating that no, gay people cannot get married, no, trans people cannot have gender-affirming healthcare, no, you can't have a gun without a license. Social liberalism, rather than legislating affirmatively that they can, would say no regulation saying gay people can't get married, no regulation saying that trans people cannot have gender-affirming healthcare, no regulation requiring a license to own a gun. It is permissive in that it allows things by default, although it's more about the tolerance of something, the lack of restriction, rather than actively accepting or protecting it. Now, in economics, conservatism would regulate that no, you can't sack your workers because they got pregnant, no, you can't dump toxic waste in the river system. Whereas economic liberals would say no regulation saying you can't fire workers for getting pregnant, no regulation saying you cannot dump toxic waste in the river system. You can be both liberal and conservative depending on where you apply them. The labels make no sense beyond tribalism. They are just to indicate which team you're on. The division is driven by propaganda, the marketing, us versus them. So that's the liberal perspective on the law, but equally important is the perspective on the government. Liberalism limits the role of government to three fundamental tasks. The first is to protect individual rights. It was originally property rights, but it evolved as at the time only certain people could own property and certain other people were property. At its heart, it's about enforcing deeds and contracts, protecting the individual right to exclusively and privately own something above the collective's right to use it. If you own land, nobody else can build on it, farm it, hunt, or gather on it. The second task, uphold the free market, meaning capitalism. Laissez-faire, private sector, profit-driven, free market capitalism. a much simpler concept: uphold the free market. The third task is the most important: do nothing else. The government should only step in when the market fails, and even then, the priority is to protect private property rights and uphold the free market. Arguably, every institution and service the government provides exists because the private sector failed to make it profitable and the need became a crisis. Some things are just too expensive or too important to leave to the private sector, as in infrastructure like roads and rail. Neoliberalism then expanded on this, mainly through economic policy, such as privatizing public assets. Remember when the private sector failed to make it profitable? Well, now that it's built, how about we give the private sector a second chance to profit from it? Sure, they didn't build the roads, but they can charge people a toll for using them. Neoliberalism promotes deregulating the economy, claiming that cutting the bureaucratic red tape will increase efficiency, when in reality, the bureaucratic red tape that they're cutting is the worker and consumer protections. And the biggest scam of them all? Running the government like a business. Because selling assets that generate revenue for less than its value is apparently what a business would do. Governments need to think long term, years, decades, perhaps even centuries ahead of time. Business only thinks in 3-month quarterlies. And when business is too big to fail, governments bail them out. But who bails out the government? The problem is not just that liberalism and neoliberalism limit the actions that government can take, but that the political parties accept these limitations as inalienable. Margaret Thatcher coined the acronym TINA, meaning there is no alternative. That appears to be an accepted truth. America has the supposedly left-wing Democratic Party, which the Australian equivalent is the Labour Party, and they have the right-wing Republican Party, with the Australian equivalent being the Liberal Party. Yes, our right-wing Conservative Party is called the Liberal Party, because they are economic liberals and social conservatives. Now, Labour and the Democrats typically don't try to fight for socially beneficial policies, despite claiming to support them, because they will inevitably be challenged in court as exceeding government authority and be ruled unconstitutional, as liberalism doesn't allow for socialism, unless it's handouts for big business, industry, or party donors, something both sides can agree on. If one side disagrees, they can challenge it in court. The courts are really important to note here, as they serve as the last check on the balance of power. There are 3 branches of government. There's the executive, which is the ruling administration that controls the government, the legislative branch, where the laws are made, typically made up of 2 chambers, which are variations on the House of Representatives and the Senate. The third branch is the judiciary, the courts. A political party can control the executive and legislative branches, but the judiciary is meant to be independent. Justice is blind in that it's not meant to have a bias for one side over another. One last note before I move on. While I have discussed the liberal view on government and its role, it is essential to understand what the number one baseline priority of government is: survival. Survival of the government. It makes sense from a certain perspective. If an asteroid hits the Earth and human civilization collapses, it's going to take a government to put it back together again. But survival of the government is more than just from hypothetical space rocks. The threat to survival can come from the military of other nations, or it can come from the demands for change of its own people. Whatever the circumstances, the government must survive. Chapter 2: The Deception That We Are Post-Colonial. Australia is an independent, sovereign nation which began as a settler colonial project. Now, it's contested when exactly we became independent, and some Australians might even be confused to hear that we are. After all, we had a failed referendum on becoming an independent republic in 1999, and the idea has been largely abandoned since. Our independence is technical. We are independent members of the Commonwealth. Our head of state is the Crown. We are ruled by King Charles III of Australia. Now, you may be wondering, what are the odds that the King of England and the King of Australia have the same name? Well, you wouldn't believe it, but it's actually the same person. But that little semantic difference of Australia makes us independent, apparently. Well, I contend that Australia is in reality still a colony, which pains me to say as I love my country and I want it to be better, but I have to acknowledge the reality. We are not who we think we are. Now, the head of the empire is not Britain anymore, it's America. After World War II, when the British Empire proved itself unable to militarily defend its colonies, but the United States could, the head of the empire changed. Now, they have a special relationship where they see themselves as co equal heads of the empire. However, America has the largest military in the world and is absolutely the one in charge. During World War II, Imperial Japan bombed Darwin, the event. So our government has since seen the protection of the American military as necessary for its survival. As such, our foreign policy is essentially whatever the American government wants it to be. Even critical parts of our domestic policy are determined by American geopolitical interests. Our country is not run for us. You may argue that this makes us a client state, not a colony, but we are still run like a colony. Colonies are run to have their resources harvested and their wealth sent back overseas. Australia's main exports are raw resources, with little in the way of processing or value added. The resources are usually taken without royalties or compensation, with the profits going to transnational corporations that pay no taxes here and offshore the wealth to tax havens where we will never get it back. We resist building long-term infrastructure that would benefit us. We have one of the greatest solar potentials of anywhere in the world, and we're largely avoiding using it, choosing instead to continue expanding natural gas extraction. We do this despite the professed concern for climate change, hypocritically making us one of the worst per capita polluters in the world. Why do we do this? Because the United States has unfriendly nations with massive reserves of gas that they can profit from. In order to keep them from profiting from their resources, we flood the market with gas so cheap that it decreases the global market value. The downside from keeping the US's unfriendlies from profiting from their resources is that we can't profit from them either. In fact, Japan is building up their economic power by reselling Australian gas for a profit. Adding to the ridiculousness is how expensive Australian gas is for us to buy domestically. We could probably import our own gas from a foreign nation for cheaper than what we pay for it at home. Make that make sense. The thing about high prices is that it acts as a justification for expanding new gas extraction, claiming that it will lower prices, but it never does because it's always exported. The issue for us is that even though we have two major parties to choose from, they both capitulate to America. The Liberal Party has the identity of colonial Australia. They are happy to be the good colony managers. Sorry, good economic managers. And for decades, the Labour Party has been too afraid to think independently. After the allegedly CIA-backed coup that oversaw the dismissal of Labour Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in 1975, the Labour Party has seemingly been allergic to independent thought. The last competent leader we had was Labour Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and even he was ousted from leadership. For Australians, our electoral choices are essentially between cowards and collaborators. And the current Labour Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is doing his best to show that Labour can lick boot just as well as the Liberals. In 2017, then US Republican President Donald Trump declared China was the United States' strategic rival. In response, then Australian Liberal Prime Minister Scott Morrison, seen here being a smug wanker, likewise declared China to be our strategic rival, despite being our largest two-way trading partner. We import more from China and export more to China than any other nation. China is largely responsible for our economic prosperity. yet we declared them to be our rival. Why? Because the US did. Morrison also signed us up to AUKUS, which I have spoken about before. It is the worst deal in Australian history. Albanese then expanded AUKUS so that now we will be taking US and UK nuclear waste and storing it on our soil. And in this latest junket to kiss the ring, our government has agreed to invest an additional almost $1 trillion from our superannuation retirement funds into the American economy, which is in a massive bubble at the moment. And when it bursts, it will make the 2008 global financial crisis look trivial. Trump has been making big claims about trillions of dollars in foreign investment, and so the lapdog of Australia writes a big check. We are a colony, and we are being harvested. Thanks, Albo. You're really looking out for our best interests. Now, if you study international politics, you might be aware that the US is shifting the language of the Pacific region. In order to de-emphasize the role of China, we're shifting the language of Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific, with India now at the helm, which really recontextualizes what happened in 2023 when, during a state visit, Prime Minister Albanese addressed Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in front of a stadium of people and told him he was the boss. Now, some people argue that I'm missing important context, that Albanese was referring to Modi selling more seats at the stadium than the American musician Bruce Springsteen, who is known as the boss. It was just a joke, a funny little reference. Do you think that's what it was? Do you think that that's what Modi heard when the Prime Minister of Australia called him the boss? It's an excuse. It's marketing. Modi heard the intended message. He is our boss because the US wants it that way. So things are not looking good for us. Our government is hamstrung by political ideology with no expressed will to change it. Our people are largely politically disengaged, and even if we, the people, wanted change, the government, Liberal or Labour, represents the interests of a foreign nation over its own people. What can we do? There have been regularly occurring pro-Palestine marches in Australia, calling for an end to the genocide and for Australia to stop sending Israel weapons components that are enabling it. The thing is, though, the Labour government feels no pressure from this. They know they won't face an electoral backlash. The Liberal alternative is even more in favour of Israel. Labour is the lesser of two evils. They know it, and they know the protesters know it too. There's no pressure to be better in a two-party system when the only alternative is perceived as a worse option. Chapter 3. Difference and Division, the Event and Change. Wait, wasn't there supposed to be some good news in here? Don't worry, it's coming, but unfortunately things are going to get worse before they get better. There are a lot of divisions in society, left versus right, the often overlooked country versus city, and of course the generational divisions, which I believe are all related. The country tends to be more right-wing, conservative and older, whereas the city tends to be more left-wing, progressive and younger. Although maybe it's middle-aged, as apparently young men are becoming more conservative, which is disturbing. I thought we were past this, but evidently we have to fight some of these battles again. Here's where I make the case for millennial leadership. Each generation is a product of its time, shaped by the events of their age. My generation, millennials, were defined by the transition to the new millennium, a literal once-in-a-thousand-year event. The year changed from 1999 to the year 2000. It wasn't when we were born, but rather when we began maturing into adulthood. The change taking place wasn't just numerical. We grew up during perhaps the greatest change in human history, the transition to the digital era. For all of human history, technology had been analog. It was gears and moving parts. It gradually transitioned to digital, which is more complex than it appears and can have no moving parts at all. Millennials were born in the analog world. We grew up during the transition and we reached maturity in the digital age. We understand analog tech better than any of the younger generations and typically understand digital technology better than the older generations. We understand both worlds in a way that no other does and possibly ever will again. We are far less susceptible to scams than either the older or younger generations. Obviously, this is a generality and there will be exceptions on both sides, along with the nebulous nature of when generations begin and end. But it is a unique common perspective for us. So, what was the world like as we headed for the new millennium? Were we hopeful for the future? Not really. In the US, there was a presidential election in dispute. Republican George W. Bush versus Democrat Al Gore, which was eventually decided by the Supreme Court in favor of Bush, which changed the course of human history. Instead of a climate change pioneer, we got a guy who bankrupted an oil company. But globally speaking, we were actually predicting the apocalypse. Hey, remember that thing that didn't happen? It was called Y2K, literally for the year 2000. The issue was that when computers were first being developed, they were exceedingly large, ridiculously expensive, and very limited in resources like storage space. One of the ways early programmers made up for the lack of space was by limiting the details of the programming, which they did with the year. They hard coded the first two digits of the year 19 so that it couldn't change. Only the last two digits could. The expectation was that by the time the year 2000 rolled around, the programming would have been updated or superseded by something else. At some point, it was realized that this had not occurred. It was predicted that when the clocks hit midnight and the time changed, the hard-coded 19 could not change to 20 and would revert back to the year 1900. This would cause cascading errors that would effectively kill all digital technology and send us back to the analog era. As you might have gathered from the fact that many young people have never heard about it and a lot of older people have forgotten, the predicted apocalypse did not happen. Not because we were wrong, but because we recognized the problem early enough that engineers were able to find a solution. It was implemented, and the event that occurred was the planned celebration. The defining moment of my generation, the new millennium, began with Y2K, the apocalypse that wasn't, which was followed 1 year later by September 11, the apocalypse that was. Wasn't that just in America? Yes, America got attacked, but the whole world got hit. It was an attack on civilized society. I'm not going to show any images. We know what it looked like. We will never forget. The worst of the event was broadcast live around the world, inflicting a trauma on everyone old enough to remember it. There are adults alive today who were born after it happened. They will never be able to comprehend what the world was like before or just how drastically it changed after. Just like any one of us cannot comprehend the world before we were born. For many millennials, this was our political awakening, and we've watched for decades the catastrophic errors in response to it. September 11 wasn't the end of the world, but it was the end of the world that existed before it. Human culture changed. The world changed. It became a darker, grittier place, the same way it did in World War II. The Holocaust was the apocalypse that changed the culture of the Jewish people. The shame of it was an apocalypse that changed German culture. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were an apocalypse that changed Japanese culture. It's all a matter of perspective. I would argue that Tiananmen Square in 1989 was one such event too. It was an apocalypse for the Chinese caught up in the massacre. For the Chinese government, however, it was an apocalypse avoided. The culture shift was stopped. The government survived. Many will know Tiananmen Square as where the Chinese government sent in the military to break up a student protest and it ended in a massacre. Which is true, but it misses some vitally important context. The student protesters were urban, educated, affluent Chinese, and the government first sent in the police, who were urban, educated, affluent Chinese. Rather than crack skulls, the police recognized the students as their people, their kids, and joined them. This was an alarm for the Chinese government. Western influence was spreading and they were facing a cultural revolution if it wasn't stopped. So they sent in the military, made up of mostly rural, uneducated, impoverished Chinese. The protesters were culturally alien to them, so when they were ordered to open fire, they did. The lesson governments learned from this was the importance of maintaining divisions in your populations, left and right, city and country, divide and conquer. If they're fighting each other, they're not fighting you. You can even use one side to enforce your will on the other, because it's when we work together that we become a threat to them, to their survival. Before I move on to my plea to Americans, I want to mention another event that we successfully addressed, something most Australians are familiar with, the hole in the ozone layer. The ozone layer protects the Earth from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation, and the hole increased our susceptibility to skin cancer. We identified in the mid-1980s that it was being caused by man-made pollution, predominantly by chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs. The international community came together through the UN and signed the Montreal Protocol to phase out the use of ozone-depleting chemicals. It worked, and the hole has been recovering since. When we can see the event coming and take appropriate action, disaster can be avoided. Finally, my plea to Americans. You are in danger. Your democracy is in danger. Many of you know this already, but perhaps hearing it in a different accent will snap people back to reality, knowing that the rest of the world sees it too. President Donald Trump is the most dangerous person on the planet. He is the world's most successful con man. He conned his way into the presidency, the office of the leader of the free world. He attempted a coup on January 6 and failed, yet managed to con his way out of any consequences for his actions. He faced so little in the way of repercussions that he was even able to run for office again, despite showing that he has no regard for electoral integrity, and conned his way back into the presidency. He learned from the January 6 failure, and his administration is preparing for a potential civil war that they will start to seize control over the US democracy as a one-party rule authoritarian state. You can see it for yourself. Trump is putting US soldiers on US streets to normalize the military occupation in the American people's psyche. It's like a vaccination for the real thing that's coming. He has no plans of leaving office. He destroyed the East Wing of the White House because he's building himself a palace. A gaudy, tacky as shit, gold-plated palace. The fuse has been lit, the countdown has begun, and the odds of a second coup attempt increase the closer you get to the next presidential election. The event will happen. I can't say what it will be because there's multiple things it could be. Trump could declare an insurrection and suspend elections, or he could try to run for a third term. Whatever it is, MAGA will end your democracy and the world order will change. This affects everyone. What about the non-MAGA Republicans in government? Surely they won't go along with it? They will, because it's been their plan for decades. The man most responsible for enabling this coup is not Donald Trump, although he is leading it. Blame can be squarely placed on one man, Mitch McConnell. Remember the whole three branches of government thing? How the judiciary acts as the final check on the balance of power? Well, Mitch McConnell spent decades filling out the US judicial system with conservative Republican-leaning judges. The intention was for a future Republican president that holds the executive and legislative branches to effectively rule like a king, as they would also control the courts that would indemnify them from any legal checks or accountability, to legitimize an illegitimate government. The Republican executive could rig the elections to win through gerrymandering or other methods. The Republican-controlled legislature would then certify the illegitimate win, leaving the only other option for Democrats being the courts to challenge it. Remember Bush v. Gore? That wasn't even a Republican majority court. If the Supreme Court rules in the Republicans' favor, then you either have a one party right wing authoritarian country under a Republican king or a second civil war. You cannot let it get to that. McConnell was probably expecting a future Republican president to be a Nixon or Reagan like character. Instead, at the apex of this project, Trump came in, took over, and filled out the last judicial spots with loyalists to him, including 3 Supreme Court picks. Good news though, he is not invulnerable. You already know what can take him down. The Epstein files. Everyone knows he's all over them. MAGA is a cult of personality and will always find an excuse for why something is okay for him, but the majority of Americans will never accept a verified child abusing pedophile as president. This is why the GOP is protecting him. This is their opportunity to fulfill their master plan. They may not be happy about protecting pedophiles, but they'll do it to seize power and rewrite history afterwards. They probably hope that the elderly Trump will die and a much cleaner Republican President JD will take over. But for now, they need the MAGA cultists, the ones who are willing to storm the Capitol, the loyal foot soldiers not bound by an oath of duty. I understand that Americans have lost family members to the MAGA cult, and I'm not sure what you can do about that. Cults of personality are like religions. They see their person as divine, godlike. Whether it's Trump fans, Elon stans, or Swifties, they will find a way to rationalize an exception for their person, because you can't see the monster for what it is when you are inside it. They don't necessarily see the bad things that their side is doing. They live in filter bubbles that won't show it to them, but they do see the responses to it, which are perceived as a personal attack. They feel challenged, they feel scared, which causes them to stubbornly dig in their heels and double down on their beliefs. Emancipation comes from within. They have to come to that conclusion themselves. The problem is that some people realize it and they don't care. Ignorance is bliss. Maybe one day they will open their eyes, they will see MAGA for what it is, and they will have to reconcile themselves with their beliefs and their actions. The Epstein files are not the only way to bring down Trump. There is another. You won't like it though, because I don't like it. It's Elon Musk. Donald Trump insinuated that Musk rigged the election. He knows those voting computers, which rigging the election would be a criminal act. Now, the world heard this as Trump threatening Elon that he had dirt on him and that he needs to fall in line. That's what he thought too, but what he actually insinuated was, Elon has dirt on me. My election was fraudulent and Elon has the receipts. That's why Elon was allowed into the government systems. Doge. That's why Trump was hawking cars in front of the White House and everything's computer in Tesla. It's why Trump sat there fecklessly behind the Resolute desk as Elon's little brat shit-talked him in front of the whole world. He could do nothing. The problem here is that they can't turn on each other. Both sides have dirt that can take the other down. It's like mutually assured destruction, except they don't have nukes. They only have suicide bombs. You can only take out the other guy by taking out yourself. They can have their blow-ups, the girls can fight, but they cannot break up. Their survival depends on the other. Therein lies the opportunity. Democratic Party, you can get Elon to turn on Trump, but it will require you to take action, a very unsavory action. You don't have to welcome him back into the fold. Let him be a pariah, but you have to offer him immunity. Immunity from prosecution for every crime in getting Trump re-elected and everything he did while Trump has been in office. Diffuse the ammunition Trump has against him, and he can freely turn. You can bring this nightmare to an end, but it will require metaphorically making a deal with the devil, because that's the lesser evil. Now, this appeal to Americans to save themselves is not entirely selfless on my part. Australia has hitched its wagon to the United States. Our government doesn't think for itself. We are your puppets. If you go down, we will likely go with you. We might not go down the path of a one party authoritarian state, but our government will accept that you have. We will toe the line. There is no one coming to save you, America. You are the ones who save us. My name is Luke Hensley, and I thank you for your time.